Right, so we're almost ready for our first speaker, and I'd like to introduce you all to Chris Bonnello. So it's over to you. Thanks.
Okay, right. Before we begin, do you mind if I just finish this? Otherwise, it'll be a huge distraction for me. I'm sure you understand. Can't leave one of these unsolved. It's like worse than swearing.
I love
Nearly done.
watching you do those. It's amazing. You're so
A
good.
lot of people say that. It's curious. Okay, done.
Oh,
Right.
amazing.
So, my name's Chris Bonnello. I'm an autistic former teacher. I've now left teaching forever for the second time. Uh, Up until earlier this year, I was a teacher in a school specifically for autistic students. In a previous life, I was a primary school teacher. And yeah, my answer to the question that you've just been asked is that I've always kind of wanted to be a builder of people. That's the phrase that I've used for quite a few years, and on reflection, was really the reason why I went into teaching. I didn't join teaching for the joy of putting knowledge into people's heads. I joined for the art of building up whole people, and yeah, I suppose that's why I ended up being so much more effective as a teacher of autistic students in special education. People make the assumption that, oh, is it because you're autistic yourself? And well, not gonna lie, that was a big part of it. So I was like the one staff member who didn't need to pretend to find the students' jokes funny. But I was just right there with them. But yeah, you may have read the title already. In fact, I think we have Insights from a Slightly Varied Teaching Career. And yeah, the reason behind that title, this is actually really refreshing talking this morning for a couple of reasons. First off, it's great that this event actually exists. Thank you, Lynn, for putting it together, because I deliver staff training all the time, but all over the country. Try not to sound showy off, but that is what a big part of my job is now. But this is the first time I've spoken specifically to an audience of autistic educators. And yeah, I basically had to plan this completely new talk from for the ground up. It's been quite nice, really. Actually, talking to a neurodivergent. I said autism. I meant neurodivergent because, well, not everyone here will be exclusively autistic. But yeah, it's been nice. And one of the things that makes it nice is that um, I feel comfortable here talking about my shortcomings as a teacher. Elsewhere, I am an inspirational autistic person, very much this inspirational, successful autistic person. But in the back of my head, it's always the things that have gone wrong and the inadequacies I've felt, that those miserable years in my 20s, all the stuff which I'd like to think I've got over now, but they're still kind of haunting me a bit. But oh yeah, fun fact. Well, not fun, actually, kind of depressing. You know, when I said I'm an inspirational autistic person, with a bit of irony in there, what I notice is that people are listening to me now. Back when I was a fairly depressed guy in his mid-20s, the autistic boy trying to become a teacher, that was my identity at the time. I was the teacher who was supposed to not be, hello cat, who was supposed to be not be succeeding at this whole teaching thing. It's my self-perception was very much based around failure. Back then, no one really gave a shit about my opinions. But now I'm an inspirational autistic person, which means, yeah, people listening now. So I'm kind of giving spoilers for part five of my five insights here, but I feel a responsibility to take full advantage of that. If people are listening to autistic voices, we need to use that advantage for what it's worth. But anyway, a brief history of me and teaching. I knew from the age of 14 that I wanted to be a primary school teacher for the rest of my life. I knew that from the age of 14, and yeah, I did have this pie in the sky, ridiculous idea of maybe becoming an author, maybe even a novelist one day. But no, that clearly wasn't going to happen. So I committed myself to primary school teaching, and at the age of 29, I abandoned teaching forever for the first time, and and then became a writer. And ultimately, So I'm at my partner's house, so I'm going to have to actually just show you the bookshelf. The Underdog series, that's mine. My actual published novel series, and the fourth and final one has just gone off to the publisher. So yeah, life has taken a few better turns in recent years. And I say better turns because so there'll be a couple of reasons for the occasional momentary silences. First off, I do technically still have a speech delay, and I get through a lot of my speaking engagements through the same means by which I got through lessons as a teacher. I just memorize most of my sentences in advance. About half the sentences I say in speaking engagements are ones that I've said before and practiced 100 times, including the one that I'm speaking right now. So yeah, and the other reason is because sometimes I'm kind of reflecting on things at the same time as saying them, which is a healthy habit as long as you have an audience that doesn't mind the occasional pause or silence. Anyway, so sorry, of all the moments cats keep coming to me now for care and attention. Here's the cat, by the way. No, Bella. I'm allergic to cats, but well, she has a good way of grabbing my attention anyway. So, a brief history of me and teaching. So, yeah, that pause just then, that was me reflecting on the fact that I was the absolute perfect student in mainstream education. I was autistic, but also I was very clever, and I had very few to no sensory issues. So I was the kind of child who was autistic in mainstream education, and I totally got away with it. It wasn't until I became an adult that the system kind of turned against me. That no, you're not good enough at teaching unless you do this, this, and this. You know, like the successful neurotypical teachers do, and so on. And also, that wasn't helped very much by me being on the teaching course, and on my very last placement, after the first day, I still do not know to this day why it suited the school's purposes to not have a teaching student. But after day one, head teacher called up the university and said, okay, we don't want Chris, he's arrogant, he's judgmental, and we're terminating his placement. Now, I was understandably rather shocked by this. The head teacher, by the way, was not on site that day. And my course mates saying, what, Chris, of all people, he's like the least judgmental person we know. And my former placements were telling the university, look, something's going on here that we don't know, because we know Chris. He was not like that when he was with us. He certainly wouldn't have been authentically like that when he was at that school for one day. And yeah, although ultimately the Board of Examiners decided that officially that placement did not exist, it was not a failed placement, they decided it was handled so badly that the university didn't have the right to call it a placement that existed. I did have the 8 years of mental health issues to contend with after that, but still officially it never existed. But I watched on in horror as the university looked for reasons for why the school must have been right to kick me out after one day. And it didn't take me long to work out why, because a school that can accommodate lots of students for years to come is a much more powerful ally than a student who have gone next year one way or the other. Anyway, I ended up kind of getting the last laugh because a year later, thanks to the support of previous placements who basically did the university's job for them, I did end up qualifying. And almost 8 years to the day after the whole thing started happening, guess where I was? Back at the old university, delivering autism training to to that year's cohort of teacher trainees, with the university staff who let me down stood there and watching. It was glorious. I don't just slay my demons; I stand on their heads and make them apologize. So, anyway, that was me with my teacher training experience. But I did qualify in the end, and I went straight into unemployment. Yeah, I was always very good at persuading interview panels that my heart was in it. I'd work extremely hard to develop children's confidence and love of learning and so on. But there'd always be one person who would sit down and just give the correct answers. So it kept me unemployed for quite a while. And I don't want to say too much more about that because, well, point number 4 is going to be about the recruitment process. But let's just say I got my first primary school teaching job on the 13th interview. Rather interestingly, there is a lot to be said for autistic single-mindedness, by the way. I do not consider it a disadvantage, because if you've only got one thing to achieve and focus on, why would you want to be anything other than single-minded? So yeah, I often say, oh, it took me 13 interviews as a way of saying, oh, I was terrible at interviews. Well, terrible what other people expect from interviews anyway. But um, other people tend to hear it and say, wow, well done for carrying on going. And like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I suppose I did show quite a lot of resilience there. But that's not really, when we're going through difficult times, we don't tend to focus on our bravery or our resilience. We just tend to focus on how crap the situation is. It's not until you're looking back that you realize, actually, yeah, I had a lot of strengths that were really worthy of recognition. So yeah, I got a string of temporary jobs, and then ended up falling out of love with the profession, and then left. But I then ended up kind of sleepwalking back into the profession through uh, out of school, um, mentoring and education through this educational charity, and they led to another contact, they led to another contact, they led to a school, and before I knew it, I ended up getting a job teaching year 11 maths in a school specifically for autistic students, and not just year 11 maths, but creative writing, and my favorite part, mentoring sessions, where it's just me and an autistic student sat in a room for 45 minutes talking about life and autism and stuff. That was my favorite part of the job, and frankly, it was where I did the most good. That's one thing I say when delivering teacher training these days. Yeah, make sure that you've got opportunities for actual well-being sessions, not just the occasional PSHE lesson where you talk about feelings, but actual meaningful timetable parts of the week where you can talk about well-being in a meaningful way. So yeah, needless to say, I really started playing to my strengths when I started working in special education, not just because I'm autistic, but also because, well, the approach that the school took was so much closer to what my attitude as a practitioner was. And the version of me in my 20s used to tell the therapist he was a failure. Oh yeah, not as an opinion, by the way. It's an objective fact. I am a failure. Those were my words at the time. I want to go back in time and slap that person silly, because I was not a failure. I've never been a failure. I have, however, been in plenty of places where I've not been able to play to my strengths. Oh yeah, you'll find me taking the occasional sip of something because I'm playing the Autistic Not Weird drinking game. Now, among the Patreon supporters for Autistic Not Weird, I haven't even talked about Autistic Not Weird. It's my website and Facebook community where I talk about autism from a personal and professional perspective. And also that it's the thing that's led to me being an autism advocate and public speaker and everything else. Yeah, among the Patreon supporters group, there's a very, very close-knit private group of people who are supporting my work as an autism advocate. We've come up with the Autistic Not Weird drinking game, and there's only 2 rules in that. First off, take a sip of water, preferably, but, well, Coke Zero if the water in your partner's house is rank. But, yeah, take a sip every time Chris says, play to your strengths. And I make no apologies for making lots of people very drunk on water, because it's just about the most important piece of advice I can give to, well, I say autistic or neurodivergent people. I'd say people in general as well. And the other rule, introduced much more recently, is take a sip every time Chris says, but I digress. Because I do go off on a lot of tangents, but in my defense, I don't care. Yeah, it's reached the point where if I know that I need to talk for 45 minutes, I plan the talk to last 30 minutes, because I know I'm going to go off on 15 minutes of things that are useful but unplanned. Anyway, so with that said, here are my 5 insights from my slightly varied teaching career. And again, thank you, Lynn, for organising this event and for basically making an environment where I actually do feel comfortable talk about the less inspirational parts of my teaching career. In fact, I think it's particularly important to do so in front of each other, so we don't feel alone. And the first thing that occurred to my head to say to all of you is that every student needs neurodivergent teachers. The reason this is the first thing to occur to me is because, yeah, it's very important when we have those moments of doubt, when we think, wait, am I the right person for this, or should I even be a teacher, and so on? Because, well, don't know about you, but I have certainly had them. It's easy to come up with reasons for why we shouldn't be teachers, or why, oh, I'm just not suited to the classroom, and so on. One of the counter arguments to that is, well, we're actually needed a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. And by the way, I'm not just saying, oh, we need neurodivergent teachers, so the neurodivergent students have someone that they connect with easier. I'm talking even the neurotypical students, even their education is better if they have a variety of brains that they're teaching them. Excuse me, that's the thing about drinking Coke Zeros rather than water. You do get the occasional burp that's trying to get out. Anyway, so what I say when I'm training teachers is that, in my very biased opinion, every student needs at least one autistic teacher before they leave education. And not just because it would really help the employment stats for autistic teachers, but also because it's just so valuable to learn from people who have an alternative perspective on the world. For exactly the same reason, I believe that every student needs to have at least one dyslexic teacher before they leave school. And yeah, once in a while, I do meet a dyslexic teacher. I'll talk about the recruitment system being a setup for everyone else, just to give you an idea of how difficult it seems to be for dyslexic teachers. Back in 2008, when I was applying for the teaching course, I went on the Department for Education website and was researching things that I need to know for the interview. And one of the frequently asked questions on the government website, Department for Education, was, I'm dyslexic. Oh, sorry, that was very rude of me. I have dyslexia. Am I still allowed to be a teacher? And the official response from the government was, yes, people with dyslexia are allowed to become teachers, as long as their dyslexia does not negatively impact their ability to read and write. Yeah, I'd like to think that things are a little bit different now, but that was literally what was said in 2008 on the government website. But occasionally you do find a dyslexic teacher who slips through the net, becomes a teacher, and in my experience, they're usually science teachers, rather awesomely. I did once meet a dyslexic English teacher, so there. Anyway, we are valuable, very, very valuable in the education profession, because taking this outside of teaching for a moment, one sentence that it sounds really soundbitey. I'm really glad of that because it's a very important sentence to memorize. Human progress depends on diversity of thought. What it means is autistic people do not exist by accident. Dyslexic people do not exist by accident. ADHD, etc., etc., etc. It is not. We are not unwanted, unintentional side effects of humans, like occasionally going wrong or whatever. No, the whole point in having neurodiversity is that progress as a species depends on having a variety of different brains approaching the vast variety of problems and issues that the human race faces, so that we can progress and look at problems from different angles. The human race would be made poorer if we focused entirely on how to make autistic people, how to make dyslexic people just a bit more normal and access the world in the same way that everyone else does. We'd suddenly stop being able to have this wide variety of problem-solving skills that we have. And one thing, going off topic a bit, but I'm reminded of a meme that made for Autistic Not Weird's Facebook page that didn't quite have the angry comments that they thought it would, but I mean something said in a training session once, which was any scientist who wants to find the autism gene and prevent autistic people from being born in the future will probably need to ask themselves where they plan on getting the next generation of scientists. But I digress. Now, looking back, there was this one teacher I had, and I really wish I could like get back into touch with him, because he's very interesting character. My year 11 graphic products teacher, looking back, blatantly autistic. It was 2002 when I was in year 11, so I had no idea what autism even was, let alone that it applied to me or him. But just for one very brief example of why it's useful to have autistic teachers, in the run-up to year 11 exams, he wrote a list of tips on the board at the front, and the very first one has stuck with me for the last 21 years, and I've passed it on to my students not just autistic students, but, well, disproportionately autistic students. And this advice so clearly came from an autistic teacher. He wrote, if you want to score high marks in an exam, do not write down the correct answer. Write down the expected answer. And that has stuck with me ever since. And so, yeah, it's particularly the case for autistic people, like me in year 7, who got asked the question in a very basic science test, how many days are there in a year? And I was, in order to get the mark, I was supposed to write down 365 and then move on to the next question. Actually, I went into a very long description of how, actually it's more like 365.25 because of the whole leap years and everything, and went into the proper astronomical side of it as well. And eventually, the science teacher did give me a mark with the comment next to it, pity you still only get 1 mark, Chris. But yeah, that was something that's really stuck with me. If you want to succeed in exams, put down the expected answer. And the only person ever to have given me that advice was a blatantly autistic teacher. So that is one illustration of why we are needed. Number 2, this is a very important one. And you already know enough about my professional background to know exactly where I'm coming from with this. Never allow the system to gaslight you into thinking you're an objectively bad teacher. Yeah, well, like I said, when I was in school, I was the perfect model student. When as an adult, suddenly I wasn't good enough. And the amount of people, honestly, the amount of students as well who think that they're terrible at maths, for example, because their brains don't resonate with the methods that Ofsted decided are cool that year. If they'd been born a few years earlier, when there was a different outstanding Ofsted accredited method, or a few years later, when the old method is now the new outstanding accredited method and so on, then they'd have been fine. But it's really kind of a birth lottery, really. And something interesting. So a few months ago, I was talking at a SEND conference up in Sheffield, and the speaker after me was an Ofsted inspector. And for the first time ever, I was giving an educational based talk in front of an Ofsted inspector who was going to be speaking after me. And I decided, okay, I'm going to stay true to my values, and I am actually going to say word for word what I was going to say about Ofsted anyway, about how they're very good at, and society as well, is very good at singing the song and dancing the dance of, oh, we're all different and diverse, and isn't it wonderful? But no, every student needs to learn the exact same method for multiplication and everything. And yeah, and how I took great pride in, when I was a special education teacher, standing up in front of my autistic teenagers and saying, there are about half a dozen different ways of getting the answer to this question right. Within reason, I don't care which method you use. Your brain, your methods, simples. And of course, I had to use the phrase within reason there because, well, autistic teenagers, literal minded, love taking the piss. Like, okay, so 61 plus 38, let's do 61 tally marks here. Tally marks. So 1, 2, 3, 4. You said we could use any method, Chris. So yeah, within reason. But yeah, I said this in front of the Ofsted inspector and told him, I started off this point by saying, oh, before I go any further, then turning to Ofsted inspector, you're welcome to give your counter argument to this later. In fact, honestly, I look forward to hearing your counter arguments because it'll be honestly interesting to hear what it's like from Ofsted's perspective. But with that said, now I've built up the tension nicely, and then I went on and said everything just said to you about the rigid and inflexibility. Isn't it weird how often the system is more rigid and inflexible than the autistic people they're letting down? So yeah, anyway, I gave the talk, sat down. Ofsted inspector stands up and says, okay, good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to start by saying I'm not going to give a counter argument to anything Chris says because he's absolutely right. So there you go. Ofsted accredited, criticism of Ofsted. Anyway, so yeah, that's like I said, one reason why I was so much more effective as a special ed teacher than a mainstream teacher, and also my self-esteem and self-perception also played a huge part. By the time I was working in special education, Autistic Not Weird had already taken off. I already had tens of thousands of followers around the world telling me how awesome I was. And it took that much to help me overcome what I was like in my 20s. because back when I was in my 20s, I was like I said, my self-perception was I am the autistic boy who is trying to become a teacher. And also, I say I was unemployed. I was a supply teacher, which feels like employment when SATs are coming up or when teachers are ill, but the rest of the time you're just trying to scramble together just bits of money here and there. I was making so little money at the time. I was getting pretty hefty tax rebates. A substantial part of my income was tax rebates from HMRC because I was earning so little under the tax threshold. But so I digress. So having so little to do was one part of my negative self-perception. The fact that the people on the important side of job interview panels, the tables, I mean, on the important side of the table, the ones who got to decide what my future looked like, they were consistently deciding that I wasn't worth paying. But they were saying some very kind words, by the way, that I think the feedback from one of them was, keep going because there's a job out there with your name on it. Like I said, I was very good at persuading people that I was the right kind of person to teach. Just wasn't the right kind of interview candidate who would get all the words right and use all the key vocabulary and all the rest of it, etc., etc. And because of that, about half my actually, no, I'm going to pause and leave that for later. Otherwise, I'll have nothing left for point 4 when I talk about the recruitment system. But this is just to give you an impression of just how low my self-esteem was back then. And the big thing that caused this point to occur to my head as something that I need to put in here was because in my supply teaching years, there was this one particular school that did most of the work supporting me. I'll be first on their list to call in if they needed someone else to do some work, occasionally even admin work, because they knew what my situation was. They very much wanted me to succeed, so they gave me as many opportunities as possible. One side effect, which, to be fair to the school, they could not help, was the fact that me, who just found out I had this thing called autism, you may have worked out by now, I'm very much identity first language rather than person first language. But back then, I just learned out that I had autism, and that, in my mind, was all the reasons for all the problems, or all the everything that I wasn't succeeding at in life. That must be down to this awesome thing that I have. And one thing that solidified that's the irony, the fact that people tell me that it's so refreshing to hear from someone with such a positive outlook on autism. And, well, yeah, to be fair, I think being autistic is pretty awesome these days, because I'm now in a place in the world where I can play to my strengths. But it has not always been like that. I've not always been autism positive. And one of the reasons for that was because while I was doing this supply teaching and not quite succeeding at anything really, all of these non-autistic teachers were getting things just right. The school I worked in was an outstanding school, not just an Ofsted accredited outstanding school, but statistically one of the best primary schools in England. It was an incredible school to work at, but I was looking at all these non-autistic success stories, and it was driving home the message that my neurodivergence was what was keeping what was making things go wrong. Jump forward in time later on, and the head teacher of the last special school that I worked in, but before I left in May earlier this year, because Autistic Not Weird was taking off so well that I literally didn't have time to teach anymore. But head teacher was saying in the meeting, we can learn a lot from Chris and how he communicates with students, you know. And yeah, it was a school that knew what my strengths were, knew what my motivations were, and gave me opportunities to play to both. They knew that my strengths were maths teaching and mentoring. They knew that my motivations were to build people up. So they gave those opportunities for wellbeing sessions and to pastoral care, as well as creative writing and maths and chess teaching and everything else. So yeah, the system is quite crap, to be honest, but that is not a reflection on you. And that leads quite neatly into my third point. The education field is big. Find your place in it. Now, I'm aware that there's at least one, perhaps multiple people in here who are going through the PGCE or are yet to qualify as teachers. And I imagine people, when I was going through it myself were probably telling me similar things to what I'm about to tell you now. But I was, well, very single-minded for some reason. I thought, no, it has to be primary school teaching. But now wisdom and life experience, positive life experience and negative life experience, has told me exactly this. The education field is big. Find your place. Different settings are right for different teachers. Towards the end of my first teaching job, their teacher told me that, with the greatest respect, Chris, I'm not sure that you're cut out to be a primary school teacher. And I don't think she meant that in a you're incompetent kind of way. It was more I don't think it really suits A, your personality, and B, the way your brain works. She had seen enough of me to know that maybe you should get a job working with particularly vulnerable students. And yeah, I'd had a placement in a special school back then, but I wasn't yet convinced that that would be where my future lay. But she was giving me all of these different possibilities as to where my future might go outside primary school teaching. And there's me, well, like I said, saying, well, no, I've spent half my life wanting to be a primary school teacher. I'm not letting go of it now. But no, letting go of it was the best thing I did, because in my head, leaving primary school teaching was not just failure, but it was leaving education altogether. But no, you don't have to be a primary school teacher. You don't have to be a secondary school teacher. You don't have to be a special education teacher. You don't have to be an out-of-school private tutor. You don't have to work for government departments of those who work with students outside the education system. You don't have to work in hospital schools. You could. There are so many different possibilities. You could be a university lecturer. You could work in sixth form colleges. You could work in nurseries. There are so many different ways to educate people, and not all of it is what people think of when they think of people who do a teaching course. You teach English as foreign languages. There's just honestly so many of them, and different environments suit different teachers. So yeah, if you are by any chance in a job where you just don't feel like you fit in there, or you're not sure whether your opportunities for career progression are pretty good, then I'm not saying leave. I'm saying be aware that there are other places to succeed. Regardless of whether you stay, whether you go, there are opportunities wider than we often give the system credit for. And even then, and what I'm about to say is quite similar to what I say to parents when they ask, so Chris, I've got an autistic child who's just about to go through the process of choosing a secondary school, and they have learning difficulties, but have been in mainstream primary education, and I don't know whether to send them to mainstream secondary education, or whether to fight for a special school place. Kind of that borderline of they could succeed in either, or it could go really wrong in either, and the parent just does not know because, well, parents don't tend to be psychic. And what I tell them is, honestly, quite similar to what I'm telling you right now, the fact that it's not just a case of is mainstream education or special education or home education or whatever, which one is better. I've worked in some primary schools that have been spectacular. I've worked in primary schools that have been less spectacular. I've worked in special schools that have been life-changingly wonderful. I've also worked in other special schools. Yes. I won't go down that rabbit hole, otherwise I'll just end up ranting. But even then, the difficult part is, if you are struggling in one mainstream primary school or one mainstream secondary school, it doesn't mean that, oh, that whole sector is not good. I mean, there might be another mainstream school out there which is perfect for you. If you, like I once did, work in a terrible special school, that does not mean that you are not suited to special education. There may be another one, like the one I ended up going to, which is perfect for you. So I wish there were easy answers to this. I really do. But, well, no, it goes beyond primary teaching or secondary teaching or university lecturing or out of school education or hospital teaching, etc., etc. It is which specific primary or secondary or special, etc., school. And often the biggest factor is the staff team and the culture that they build. So yeah, that's that also kind of leads on to at least one thing that I'm going to say at the long-awaited point 4. The recruitment system is crap, but it's not insurmountable. So yeah, the thing I was going to say earlier is that, yeah, I was very good at showing people the person I was at teaching interviews. And, well, I've kind of always been good at that. So I think maybe that's one reason why I was, quite effective at building up relationships with young people, because the young people in whether mainstream or special education, they don't care whether you can answer interview questions properly. They care whether you are a person who they can connect with. And frankly, I think that's part of the reason for my success as an autism advocate as well. The fact that I'm 100% authentic. I have one personality and I take it wherever I go. So yeah, that's another thing that that didn't like about primary education. The fact that I was once told half of primary education is acting, and I'm just a terrible actor. I resolved to never become what I used to call a goodness me teacher. That was a phrase I used to call them, the goodness me teachers. You know, the year 2 teacher would say, goodness me, when a child behaves inappropriately or something, because no one in real life uses the phrase goodness me, except for a year 2 teacher who's pretending to be shocked at child behavior. No, when I was annoyed with the students, they knew what kind of annoyed I was. I was just very good at emotional regulation in front of young people. So they knew when I was annoyed, but they also knew that I didn't think less of them. I think basically the interpersonal side of it I got right, even though that's not the thing you get called an Ofsted accredited outstanding teacher for, sadly. Anyway, but I digress. I may have been very good at telling people what my personality was, and and I was about to say I got interview panels on my side. Well, clearly not very much on my side, otherwise they would have given me the bloody job. But about half of the 12 failed interviews were silver medals. And that was both really encouraging and really frustrating, because as I used to phrase it at the time, coming second into job interviews, kind of like coming second in the Hunger Games. I mean, for all the good it did, you might as well have come last. And I was a massive Hunger Games fanboy back in the day. But yeah, one thing that really annoys me about, in all fairness, in all credit to the teaching profession, it's very rare that you find an interview that is just sit down, questions and answers, okay, get out. There was actually one, actually probably multiple teaching interviews I went to where literally was just sit down, answer questions from the adults. Most teaching interviews do at least give teachers an opportunity to demonstrate that they can communicate with young people, whether it's teach a lesson for 25 minutes or answer questions from the school council and so on. But if it's just Q&A, these days I've my own pet phrase for it. I call them spoken word beauty contests. And these days, when I deliver talks for employers, I actually use that phrase, make sure that your recruitment system is better than just spoken word beauty contests. And one thing I say, I memed it and put it on Autism at Weir's Facebook page. One reason why the autism employment rate is so low. So the interviewer says, sorry, Steve, we can't offer you the job. I know you'd be an expert at building houses, but there was this other candidate who was really, really good at talking about building houses. What, you're kidding, right? But yeah, that is what spoken word beauty contests really are about. They're biased towards people who know how to play the game when it comes to interviews. And yeah, that is what I ask employers. Would you rather have someone who can build houses or someone who can talk about building houses? But like I said, it's not insurmountable. I can, ironically, I often give talks about how to help autistic people get jobs. It's almost like I'm the least suited person for it because of my repeated record of job interview failures. But actually, some people call it failures. I call it experience. And yeah, there's a lot of insight that I can share and do share with employers or prospective employees about how to fight past a recruitment system built without it in mind. And one thing, obviously, I say to employers is if you want better employees, this isn't just the inclusion game like look at us, we're making it more accessible for disabled people and autistic people and dyslexic people, etc., etc. It's not just about that. Even if you remove everything about neurodivergence from the discussion, you still just get better employees. If you change the recruitment system so that you can actually see, and not just see, but actually base the criteria on what you observe in what the candidates would actually be doing in the job. Because I was fairly good delivering 25-minute lessons, but because so much of the person's specification is what happens in the question and answer part of it, that's what let me down. If 100% of the interview, or nearly 100%, was delivering the lesson, maybe it would have been employed earlier. But in terms of how to get past it from your perspective, you know that phrase, beggars can't be choosers? Well, in this particular context, I think that's wrong. I think beggars should be choosers. When I was trying to get my first job, my family were encouraging me to go for absolutely every single job because you need to get paid, Chris. You need to get the money. You need to at least get your foot in the door, etc., etc. But I'm here to tell you that it is better to stay unemployed for a bit longer and then get a job that suits you than get the first job that comes your way and spend the next 6 months feeling really miserable, working for a boss who hates you, being dysregulated all the time because they refuse to accommodate you, leaving after 6 months, and guess who's your reference for your next job? It is better to be strategic about it. So one way that I was actually really pleased about the way I did this, by the way. So my version of choosing despite begging was when I wrote my person specification, I focused, I did most of it based on what kind of teacher, what kind of person I was, what my philosophy towards teaching was about building up the whole person and everything that they've just been telling you. And then a bit at the end, oh yeah, by the way, I'm pretty effective at teaching and putting knowledge in people's heads. My specialism is maths. So, I included that bit, but it was playing second fiddle, so to speak, to the person I was. Now, there are two kind of primary schools, mainstream primary schools out there. The ones who would really, really like that, and those who say, yeah, that's all very nice, but well, we're more about the statistics and climbing up the league tables. And those schools I would not have enjoyed working in. So me phrasing my personal statement like that automatically meant that any school that would give me an interview would be a school that I would really want to work at. It was a great way of filtering out the schools that weren't right for me. Now, in terms of the tips, I probably don't quite have time to put the because Lynn's just held up a piece of paper saying 5 minutes left, and that was at least 2 minutes ago. So in the Q&A towards the end of the day, please do ask me, Chris, what are your tips for how autistic people should behave in interviews and how to formulate good interview answers? Because I'll give you the advice then. But in the meantime, I'd like to finish off with point number 5, which is the tide is turning. Right at the start of this talk, I talked about the basically the ableist Department for Education advice about people with dyslexia applying for teaching. And back then in 2008, you could basically get away with it. In fact, well, depending on the context, you could probably still get away with it. But it is becoming less and less acceptable. In fact, this conference, could this conference have existed 15 years ago? Like a conference by autistic practitioners for autistic practitioners. I mean, maybe in the underground autistic movement, maybe there'd have been something that 5 people would have turned up to, and but no, these days you can just put it on the internet, and there'll be generally 2 responses: autistic teachers who it applies to, thinking, "Oh, that's awesome," and either non-autistic people or non-teachers look at it and thinking, "Oh, I'm really glad that exists." I mean, there's a place for it now where there may not necessarily have been, or there wouldn't have been a recognised place for it earlier. Now, I wonder if, had I been born 10 years later and qualified 10 years later and gone for my first job 10 years later, would my first steps into teaching have been easier? I would like to hope yes. Maybe I would have even found out that my place in teaching was more special education or training teachers earlier than I did. But it's all very well saying, oh, things were so bad in the past. But frankly, I'm glad that things were worse in the past than they are now, because logically it means things are better now. Now, the tide is turning, but that is the thing with tides. They turn slowly. So this requires a lot of effort, but also a lot of patience. It's like building up a person. You can't just go to a teenage autistic student with very low self-esteem and say some magic words and then suddenly, oh, brilliant, my self-perception is much healthier now. Exactly with them, as much as with the teaching profession, it is, you're in it for the long haul. The tide will turn with your students, but it turns slowly. In fact, with students, I tend to use the analogy of the stock market. Pretending that we're not going through a recession, pretending that we're living in precedented times. Typically speaking, some days the stock market goes up, some days the stock market goes down. But generally speaking, over time, it goes up. And you'll often find out with your students, sometimes you'll have good days, sometimes you'll have bad days, but generally speaking, if their needs are being catered for and if they know that they're cared about, and if they are in a school which tells them that what their strengths are and that their strengths are valuable and gives them opportunities to play those strengths, then generally speaking, regardless of the ups and downs, they will generally speaking go up and their self-perception will improve. And I wasn't originally, that does actually count as a digression as well. I've got to take 2 sips now, but I was originally intending to use that as an analogy for the wider teaching profession, but it's kind of similar. We are in this for the long haul. The tide does turn very slowly, but it turns, and it turns after lots of effort. And also, I'm remembering, I wish I could remember who it was who taught me this, but it's something that's, I'm pretty sure it might have been Steve Silverman actually over dinner. But yeah, I think it was him who said, yeah, Chris, you and your neurokin should really take advantage of the fact, like I said at the start, that people are talking about autism and neurodivergence now. It has become a hot topic. Is now the cool thing to discuss. It's like you can almost compare it to, you know, in Pride Month where all the corporations are splatting rainbows over everything, and you can either see that very cynically as in, oh well, how come all of these corporations weren't in favor of gay marriage until the day it was made legal, and then suddenly they were in favor of gay marriage. You could be really cynical about that, or you could take the positives that are there from it. You know what? Even regardless of whether they mean it or whether it's just a corporate money-making thing, either way, people are discussing it, and we need to take advantage of it. So regardless of whether people talking positively about autism are doing so out of a genuine wish to accommodate neurodivergent people, or whether it's just, well, everyone else is talking about, so we have to kind of keep up with the times, we should still take full advantage of the fact that it's a hot topic right now. The world is listening to us for now. And what autism awareness looks like and what autism acceptance looks like 10 years from now depends entirely on how autism gets talked about now. That's one reason why I'm so glad to be a part of this massive autism awareness / acceptance drive that's really taken off this last decade. So whether you're the kind of person who feels comfortable being open about your autism in the workplace, I'm not suggesting that you do be, by the way, because when I was a primary school teacher, I kept it a real secret, except for my mentor and head teacher. When I worked in special education, for the 10th anniversary of my autism diagnosis, my autiversary as I called it, at the end of the day, I was handing out bags of Haribos to the students as they went home in celebration of my autiversary. I could not have done that in mainstream education, but I was out and proud when I was in special education. But yeah, even if it's just on Facebook or just on Twitter, we need to take full advantage of the opportunities that we have right now, because maybe in 10 years' time, the education system will be even more friendly to autistic people. And yeah, that is basically everything that I can fit into the time. I've only gone a few minutes over, which is pretty impressive by my standards. But those are my insights from my very varied teaching career. thank you again for being an audience. As willing to support this event and take stuff from this event, and B, being the kind of people who I feel comfortable talking about my shortcomings with. I can afford to be less inspirational here, and that really means something. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. And if this talk helps just one of you, then I'm going to be really disappointed because I'm actually hoping for more than one. But that's me done. And thank you very much.